In the 1990s, a team of researchers at MIT put a rat in a T-shaped maze. At the end of one arm of the T was a piece of chocolate. The rat had never been in the maze before. Electrodes monitored its brain activity as it explored. What the researchers found was not surprising. The rat's brain was highly active throughout the exploration. It was processing information constantly, building a map, attending to every sound and smell and texture. They ran the rat through the maze repeatedly over days. Something changed. The rat learned the route. It ran it faster. It stopped exploring and started executing. And as it did, the brain activity changed dramatically. The regions associated with decision-making and attention quieted. A different region became active. The basal ganglia, a deep and evolutionarily ancient structure associated with procedural learning and habit. The behavior had moved from effortful conscious control to automatic execution. The rat was no longer thinking about how to get the chocolate, it was just getting the chocolate. What the MIT researchers had observed was the neurological process by which behavior becomes habit. And what it revealed was that habits are not weakened decisions or failed willpower. They are a fundamentally different mode of behavior controlled by different brain structures operating by different rules. The habit loop is the basic architecture of automatic behavior. Charles Duhigg, drawing on the MIT research and subsequent work, described it as a three-part structure. The cue, a trigger in the environment or internal state that initiates the behavior, the routine, the behavior itself, the reward, the outcome that reinforces the association between cue and routine. The loop, repeated enough times, becomes encoded in the basal ganglia as a chunk behavioral unit. The cue activates the chunk executes automatically, the reward strengthens the encoding over time, the behavior requires less and less conscious direction. It happens.
Right.
This is why habits are so difficult to break through willpower alone. The habit is not stored where willpower operates. Willpower is a function of the prefrontal cortex, the conscious, deliberative, effortful part of the brain. The habit is stored in the basal ganglia. Deciding not to do something is a prefrontal operation. The habit cue activates a basal ganglia program. The two systems are not in direct competition on equal terms. The automaticity of habitual behavior is both the source of its power and the source of its difficulty. On the power side, automaticity frees cognitive resources. A behavior that requires no conscious direction consumes essentially no working memory, no decision-making capacity, no attentional resources. This is why skilled performance feels effortless compared to learning. The expert pianist is not consciously directing each finger movement. The basal ganglia is running a highly refined program while the conscious mind is free to attend to interpretation and expression. Human life would be impossible without habits. The cognitive load of consciously directing every behavior, every movement, every word, every routine action would be paralyzing. Habits are the brain's solution to the problem of limited conscious bandwidth. Most of what you do most of the time is habit, which frees the conscious mind for the relatively small number of situations that genuinely require it. The difficulty is that the basal ganglia does not distinguish between good habits and bad ones. It encodes whatever is repeated in whatever context produces a reward. The reward does not have to be large or conscious, it just has to be present. Smoking is a behavior that is physiologically unpleasant the first time most people try it. It becomes a habit through the repeated association of the cue, stress, social situations, specific times of day with the routine of smoking and the reward of nicotine's effect on dopamine systems. The oral stimulation, the social belonging, the loop encodes, the behavior becomes automatic. The decision to smoke stops being a decision. The same mechanism that makes expertise possible, makes addiction possible. The basal ganglia is agnostic about what it automates. Keystone habits are habits that appear to trigger cascades of other behavior changes. Exercise is the most studied example. People who establish a regular exercise habit report improvements in diet, sleep, productivity, and mood that were not directly targeted by the exercise itself. The mechanism appears to be partly the sense of agency and self-efficacy that comes from successfully establishing any habit. The experience of being someone who does what they intend to do generalizes to other domains, and partly the physiological effects of exercise that improve the substrate on which other habits operate. Sleep is another keystone habit. Adequate, consistent sleep improves decision-making, emotional regulation, and impulse control, all of which affect the difficulty of establishing other habits. The person who sleeps well has better prefrontal function, which means better ability to initiate and maintain intentional behavior change. The sequence matters. Trying to change many habits simultaneously is less effective than establishing one foundational habit that creates conditions for other changes to follow. The environment is more powerful than intention in determining habitual behavior. Studies consistently find that changing the environment, restructuring the cues that trigger habitual behavior is more effective than trying to resist cues through willpower. People who put fruit on the counter eat more fruit. People who put their running shoes by the door exercise more. People who remove the TV from the bedroom sleep better. The behavior follows the cue. Change the cue and the behavior follows. This has a corollary that is less comfortable. The environments most people inhabit were not designed with their long-term well-being in mind. They were designed by companies whose revenue depends on specific habitual behaviors. The phone designed to be checked, the food designed to be craved, the platform designed to be scrolled, the cues are engineered. The habits they produce are not accidental. Knowing this is the beginning of designing your own environment rather than being designed by someone else's. Whatever you did today that felt automatic, the good things and the less good things, was your basal ganglia running programs that were encoded through repetition at some point in the past. The programs can be changed, not quickly, not through deciding differently in the moment when the cue fires and the routine is already running, through repetition of a different routine in the same context until the new program encodes, which is work, but it is work that once done runs without effort. The effort is front-loaded. The return is permanent. Tonight, the programs pause. The basal ganglia quiets along with everything else. The slate is not wiped clean, but it rests, and rested systems run better.
That's not philosophy. That's just how the brain works.
On October 29th, 1969, a computer at UCLA sent a message to a computer at the Stanford Research Institute. The message was supposed to be the word login. The system crashed after the first two letters. The first message ever sent over what would become the internet was low. The researcher who made the call to Stanford to confirm the transmission said later that he hadn't appreciated the significance of what was happening. He was trying to solve a technical problem. He was not thinking about what he was initiating. Nobody was the people who built ARPANET, the Defense Department-funded network that became the foundation of the internet, were solving specific engineering problems. How to send information between computers at different locations, how to build a network that could survive nodes being destroyed. The Cold War context made this militarily relevant. How to allow different computer systems to communicate with each other. They were not thinking about social media. They were not thinking about e-commerce or streaming video or online dating or the way information would reshape politics and culture and human attention. They were thinking about packets and protocols and routing. The distance between what they were building and what they built is one of the most striking examples in history of unintended consequences at civilizational scale. The early internet was text, slow, technical, accessible only to researchers and academics, requiring significant technical knowledge to use. The culture that developed in this early period was specific and in many ways peculiar collaborative information sharing, suspicious of commercial interests, deeply committed to openness. The norms of the early internet were shaped by the people who populated it, who were overwhelmingly academics and engineers with specific values about how information should flow. The World Wide Web, invented by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN in 1989 and released publicly in 1991, changed everything. The web was not the internet. It was a layer on top of the internet that made it navigable by ordinary people. Hyperlinks, browsers, the ability to move between documents with a click, the graphical interface that made the internet something other than a command line. Berners-Lee gave it away. He did not patent it. He did not seek to control it. He released the web as an open standard available to everyone because he believed correctly, as it turned out, that it would only realize its potential if anyone could build on it without permission or payment. The decision to not monetize one of the most valuable inventions in human history was made by a single person who believed in something more than money. The internet we have is partly the result of that belief. The commercialization of the web in the mid-1990s brought a wave of investment and entrepreneurship that produced both extraordinary innovation and one of the most spectacular financial bubbles in history. The dot-com boom of the late 1990s was driven by the correct intuition that the internet was going to change everything, combined with the incorrect intuition that it was going to change everything immediately, and that any business with a website was therefore valuable. Companies with no revenue and no plausible path to revenue attracted hundreds of millions in investment. Valuations were detached from any conventional financial reality. The crash of 2000 to 2002 wiped out trillions in market value. Hundreds of companies disappeared. The survivors, Amazon, Google, a handful of others, emerged leaner and more focused and went on to become among the most valuable companies in history. The bubble was irrational. The underlying intuition that drove it was correct. The internet did change everything, just more slowly than 1999 assumed, and in ways that 1999 couldn't fully anticipate. The social internet, the internet as a place for human connection and communication rather than primarily information retrieval, developed gradually, and then suddenly Friendster launched in 2002, MySpace in 2003, Facebook in 2004, initially only for Harvard students and then expanding rapidly to other universities and then to everyone, Twitter in 2006, Instagram in 2010. The platforms that came to define social media emerged within a decade of each other, each building on what the previous ones had established, each making different bets about what people wanted from online social interaction. What people wanted, it turned out, was everything. Connection with distant friends and family, news and information, entertainment, validation, conflict, community, a place to perform identity and receive feedback on the performance, a place to witness the lives of others and compare them to their own. The platforms gave people what they wanted and discovered that what people wanted could be made more intense, more engaging, more compulsive through algorithmic optimization. The feed that shows you what you're most likely to engage with shows you what makes you most emotional, because emotion drives engagement. Outrage, desire, fear, fascination, these are the emotions that keep people scrolling. The algorithm did not intend this. It optimized for engagement and discovered that certain emotional states are more engaging than others. The internet changed human memory in ways that are still being understood. The Google effect, documented by Betsy Sparrow at Columbia, found that people are less likely to remember information they know they can look up. The brain offloads memory for information to the device the way it offloads spatial memory to GPS when external storage is reliably available. The internal storage system adjusts. We remember less because we have to remember less. This is not obviously bad. The brain has limited capacity, and offloading factual memory to external systems frees that capacity for other uses. The question is what the freed capacity is being used for and whether the offloading has costs beyond the obvious ones. What appears to be affected is not just factual memory, but the connective tissue between facts. The ability to synthesize information, to see patterns across domains, to think creatively by combining things that aren't usually combined. Deep knowledge of a domain built through the slow accumulation of remembered facts and their connections produces a different kind of thinking than access to searchable facts produces. Whether one is better than the other or what combination is optimal is a question the experiment of the internet is still running. The internet is approximately 55 years old if you date it from ARPANET, and approximately 30 years old if you date it from the web. 30 years, the printing press took a century to fully reshape European society. The internet has reshaped global society in 3 decades and is still accelerating. The people alive today are the first humans to have lived in a world transformed by the internet from birth. The cognitive, social, and psychological effects of that transformation are still being measured. The baselines keep moving. The experiment has no control group. What we are is partly what the internet has made us. What that is exactly is still becoming clear. Right now, the internet is running servers in buildings. You will never see processing requests from people on every continent. Data moving at the speed of light under oceans, the global nervous system doing what it does around the clock without pause. You don't have to be part of it right now. You're allowed to be the thing the internet is not. Offline, present, here, in a body, in a specific place, in the dark, which is where humans have always gone at the end of the day, before any of this existed, and will go long after. The most distant object ever observed by human beings is a galaxy designated HD1. was identified in 2022 using data from multiple space telescopes, including the Hubble and Spitzer. The light reaching us from HD1 left its source approximately 13.5 billion years ago, when the universe was only about 300 million years old. We are seeing that galaxy as it existed 300 million years after the Big Bang. The galaxy no longer exists in the form we are observing. It may not exist at all. The light that tells us about it is ancient beyond comprehension. We are looking at the past so deep that the universe itself was barely formed. And HD1 is not at the edge of the observable universe. It is simply the most distant thing we have managed to resolve. The observable universe extends further, much further, to the cosmic microwave background, the afterglow of the Big Bang itself, which represents the limit of what we can see, not because there's nothing beyond it, but because the universe was opaque before it and light could not travel freely. Beyond that boundary, the universe continues. We simply cannot see it. The observable universe is a sphere centered on Earth with a radius of approximately 46 billion light years. This number surprises people who know that the universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. If nothing can travel faster than light, how can the observable universe be 46 billion light years in radius when light has only had 13.8 billion years to travel? The answer is expansion. Space itself is expanding. The galaxies at the edge of the observable universe were much closer when they emitted the light we are now receiving. In the time that light has been traveling to us, the space between us has expanded enormously. The galaxy that emitted the light we are now receiving as the edge of the observable universe has moved much further away in the intervening 13 billion years. The edge of the observable universe is not where things are now. It is where things were when the light left. The universe is much larger than the observable portion and is getting larger every moment. The cosmic microwave background is the oldest light in the universe. It was released approximately 380,000 years after the Big Bang, when the universe had cooled enough for electrons and protons to combine into hydrogen atoms, a moment called recombination. Before recombination, the universe was a hot, dense plasma opaque to light. After recombination, the universe became transparent, and photons could travel freely for the first time. Those photons have been traveling ever since. They have been stretched by the expansion of the universe from the visible and ultraviolet wavelengths at which they were emitted to microwave wavelengths, which is why we detect them as microwaves rather than visible light. They bathe the entire sky uniformly at a temperature of approximately 2.7 degrees above absolute zero. When you turn on an analog TV and see static, some small fraction of that static is the cosmic microwave background, the noise of the Big Bang arriving in your living room, 380,000 years after it was released and 13.8 billion years after the universe began. The universe is not only expanding, but accelerating in its expansion. This discovery, made in 1998 by two teams of astronomers studying distant supernovae, earned the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2011 and remains one of the most puzzling findings in modern cosmology. The expansion of the universe should be slowing down. Gravity pulls matter together and should be breaking the outward momentum of the Big Bang. Instead, it is speeding up. Something is causing the acceleration. Physicists call it dark energy, a placeholder name for something they do not understand. Dark energy appears to constitute roughly 68% of the total energy content of the universe. Dark matter, a different unknown substance that explains the behavior of galaxies and galaxy clusters, constitutes roughly 27%. Everything we can see, touch, measure directly, or detect with any instrument, all the stars, planets, gas, dust, black holes, and light in the universe, constitutes approximately 5% of what exists. 95% of the universe is unknown in its fundamental nature, not unmeasured in its details, unknown in what it is. The fate of the universe depends on dark energy and what it does over cosmic timescales. The leading model is the big freeze or heat death. The expansion continues and accelerates. Galaxies recede from each other until they are beyond each other's observable horizons. Stars exhaust their fuel and die black holes, slowly evaporate through Hawking radiation over timescales so vast that writing out the numbers is essentially meaningless to human intuition. The universe approaches maximum entropy, a state of uniform temperature, uniform distribution, no gradients to drive any process, no available energy to do any work. The last black holes will evaporate in approximately 10 to the power of 100 years. The universe is currently 13.8 billion years old, approximately 10 to the power of 10 years. The black hole evaporation era begins at 10 to the power of 40 years. The timescales involved in the ultimate fate of the universe are so much larger than the current age of the universe that the current age is, by comparison, essentially the first instant scenario. We are at the very beginning of cosmic time. There is a concept in cosmology called the cosmic horizon, the boundary beyond which objects are receding from us faster than the speed of light due to the expansion of space. Objects beyond the cosmic horizon are permanently unreachable and their light will never reach us. They're not just distant, they are causally disconnected in a real physical sense outside our universe in the only meaningful definition of that phrase. The universe we can reach, the universe we can observe, the universe we can interact with in any way is a bubble in something much larger, and the bubble is shrinking relative to the whole as expansion accelerates. Our universe is getting smaller in the sense that matters, not in size, in reach, lying here under a sky that contains all of this. The light from HD1 arriving tonight after 13 billion years of travel. The cosmic microwave background washing over everything at 2.7 degrees above nothing. The 95% of existence that has no name and no explanation pressing against the 5% that does. The universe is not indifferent to you. Indifference requires awareness. The universe is simply vast in a way that makes the question of its attitude toward you not quite the right question. You're made of it.
The same matter, the same physics.
The 5% that knows it exists. Looking out at the rest? That is not nothing. That is, in fact, extraordinary. Asleep now, the universe will still be there. All of it. Going wherever it is going. In 1969, a Swiss-American psychiatrist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross published a book called On Death and Dying. She had spent years interviewing terminally ill patients at the University of Chicago Medical School, sitting with dying people and asking them what they were experiencing, what they needed, what they wished the medical system understood about what it felt like to be dying. It was an unusual thing to do in a medical culture that largely avoided the subject. From those interviews, she proposed 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. The stages were meant to describe the emotional experience of people facing their own deaths. They were not meant as a universal model of grief for every kind of loss. They were not meant as a sequence that everyone follows. Kubler-Ross herself was explicit about this. None of that prevented the 5 stages from becoming the most widely cited and most widely misapplied framework in the psychology of loss. For decades, people were implicitly or explicitly told that their grief should follow a sequence, and that deviating from that sequence, grieving out of order, skipping stages, returning to earlier stages, was somehow doing it wrong. The research has since established that grief does not follow stages. It does not follow a predictable sequence. It does not have a correct form, and the attempt to impose a template on grief has caused significant additional suffering to people who were already suffering enough. What the research actually shows about grief is more complicated and in some ways more useful than the stage model. George Bonanno at Columbia University has spent his career studying how people respond to loss, and his findings have overturned several assumptions that the stage model reinforced. The most significant is about resilience, the dominant assumption embedded in the stage model, and in much of grief counseling practice, was that grief necessarily involves a prolonged period of significant distress, and that people who did not show that distress were in denial, suppressing their grief, and would pay for it later. Bonanno's longitudinal studies found something different. Roughly half to 2/3 of people who experience significant loss, bereavement, serious illness, trauma show what he calls the resilient trajectory. They experience distress, they may be sad, disoriented, intermittently overwhelmed, but they maintain relatively stable functioning. They don't experience the prolonged debilitating depression that the stage model assumed was normal and necessary. The resilient response is not denial. The people showing it are not suppressing their grief or avoiding their emotions. They are grieving and also functioning, and the two are not incompatible. Resilience in the face of loss is not unusual or suspect. It is the most common response. The oscillation model, developed by Margaret Strobe and Hank Shute, describes grief as movement between 2 orientations rather than progression through stages. Loss orientation involves focusing on the loss itself, the person or thing that is gone, the pain of the absence, the yearning, the grief, emotions directly. Restoration orientation involves focusing on the secondary consequences of loss, the practical challenges created by the loss, the adjustment to a changed life, the building of new roles and relationships and meaning. Healthy grieving on this model involves oscillating between the two. Time spent in loss orientation processes the emotional reality of the loss. Time spent in restoration orientation maintains the capacity to function and builds toward a changed but viable future. Getting stuck in either orientation without the other produces problems. Prolonged loss orientation without restoration leads to complicated grief. Restoration orientation without adequate loss orientation leaves the emotional reality unprocessed. The oscillation is not a stage sequence. It is an ongoing dynamic that continues indefinitely, becoming less frequent and less intense over time, but not ending. People who have lost someone they love do not get over it. They learn to carry it differently. Complicated grief, sometimes called prolonged grief disorder, is the clinical condition that emerges when grief does not follow the adaptive trajectory. It is characterized by persistent, intense yearning for the lost person. Difficulty accepting the reality of the loss, bitterness, feeling that life is meaningless without the person, inability to trust others since the loss, and a sense that a part of the self has died. The symptoms persist at high intensity for more than a year after the loss and do not diminish with time in the way typical grief does. Complicated grief affects roughly 10% of bereaved people. It is associated with specific risk factors, the nature of the loss, the prior relationship, prior mental health history, the quality of social support. It responds to specific therapeutic interventions that are different from those used for depression or ordinary grief. What makes it distinct from depression, with which it often coexists, is its specificity. The suffering is organized around the loss. The yearning and the protests against the reality of the loss are central. In a way, they are not in depression. The treatment accordingly focuses on processing the specific reality of the specific loss rather than the general negative cognitions of depression. The function of grief is a question that evolutionary psychology has addressed with some interesting results. Grief is universal across human cultures. Every human society has mourning practices. The experience of grief, the pain of loss, the yearning for the absent, the protest against the reality of the loss appears to be species typical rather than culturally constructed, which suggests it has been selected for. John Archer at the University of Central Lancashire has argued that grief is the cost of attachment. The same system that drives us toward close relationships, that makes us seek, maintain, and value bonds with specific others, produces grief when those bonds are severed. The grief is not a malfunction of the attachment system, it is the attachment system responding appropriately to loss. You cannot have one without the risk of the other. The depth of the grief is a measure of the depth of the bond, which is a way of saying that grief is love with nowhere to go. The love does not disappear because the person is gone. It continues looking for its object, unable to find it, experiencing the absence as pain. Whatever you're carrying tonight, whatever losses are part of the weight of this specific day in this specific life, the carrying is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that something mattered. That is not a small thing. A loss that costs nothing was connection, that cost nothing. The grief is the other side of the love. Both real, both yours. Tonight, the carrying can be set down for a few hours. Not abandoned. Set down, it will be there in the morning. It keeps asleep now. In the 1990s, a forest ecologist named Suzanne Simard was doing something that her colleagues considered unusual. She was injecting radioactive carbon into birch trees in the forests of British Columbia and waiting to see where it went. What she found changed how scientists think about forests. The carbon moved not through the air, not through direct root contact, through the soil, through a network of fungal threads called mycorrhizae that connected the roots of the birch to the roots of Douglas fir trees nearby. The birch was sending carbon to the fir. The fir, in other seasons and other conditions, sent carbon back. The trees were trading, not metaphorically, chemically, measurably, in quantities that mattered to the health of the recipient. The forest was not a collection of individual competing organisms. It was a network, a community with something that functioned at a biological level like cooperation. Simard called the largest and oldest trees in these networks mother trees, hub trees that were connected to hundreds of younger trees and that appeared to preferentially channel resources toward their own offspring seedlings. The term was evocative enough to generate both scientific discussion and significant popular attention. Her work became the basis for the Wood Wide Web, the popular name for the mycorrhizal networks that connect trees across forest ecosystems. Mycorrhizal fungi are among the oldest and most widespread organisms on Earth. The relationship between fungi and plant roots is ancient. Fossil evidence suggests it dates back at least 450 million years. To the period when plants first colonized land, the earliest land plants appear to have had mycorrhizal partners. The relationship may have been essential to the colonization of land in the first place, the fungi providing mineral nutrients that the plants needed but could not access in the new terrestrial environment, the plants providing sugars that the fungi needed from photosynthesis. In a mycorrhizal relationship, the fungal threads, hyphae, penetrate or surround the cells of plant roots, dramatically increasing the effective surface area through which the plant can absorb water and minerals. Phosphorus and nitrogen in particular, nutrients that are often limiting in forest soils, are delivered to plants through mycorrhizal networks in quantities they could not access through roots alone. In return, the plant provides the fungus with sugars produced through photosynthesis. The fungus cannot photosynthesize. The plant provides what the fungus needs. The fungus provides what the plant needs. Neither does as well without the other. The extent of mycorrhizal networks in forest soil is extraordinary. A teaspoon of forest soil contains several kilometers of fungal hyphae. The network extends through the entire soil volume of a forest, connecting most of the trees in that forest to each other into a shared fungal organism or multiple fungal organisms that can cover hectares. The largest known fungal organisms in the world are mycorrhizal network. Honey fungus in Oregon's Blue Mountains covers nearly 10 square kilometers and may be several thousand years old. The network is not passive infrastructure. It is an active system through which materials move in response to conditions. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, water, and chemical signals all move through mycorrhizal networks. The direction and quantity of flow responds to the needs and conditions of the connected organisms. Whether this constitutes communication in any meaningful sense, whether information is transmitted as well as materials, is one of the more contested questions in the field. The communication question is where the science gets more complicated and where popular accounts have sometimes outrun the evidence. Simard's work on carbon transfer is well established and replicated. The extension of this to the claim that trees are consciously communicating, nurturing their offspring, warning each other of threats. This is where scientists disagree about how far the evidence reaches. There's evidence that trees respond to damage by producing chemical signals, volatile organic compounds that neighboring trees can detect and respond to by upregulating their own defenses. This has been documented in multiple species and appears real. Whether it constitutes communication in any intentional sense or whether it is simply a chemical reaction that other organisms have evolved to respond to, it depends partly on how you define communication. There is evidence that stressed trees, drought-stressed, insect-attacked, receive more carbon from connected neighbors through mycorrhizal networks than unstressed trees. Whether this is the network actively redistributing resources to those in need or simply the passive consequence of the stressed tree drawing more strongly on available resources is debated. The network exists, materials move through it. The trees connected by it are measurably affected by those movements. Whether the forest is in any meaningful sense aware of itself is a question that the biology can raise but not yet answer. The practical implications of mycorrhizal research have significant consequences for forestry and conservation. Industrial forestry clear-cutting, followed by replanting, disrupts mycorrhizal networks severely. The replanted trees without established fungal partners establish more slowly and survive at lower rates than trees establishing an intact forest. The soil is not just dirt, it is living infrastructure that took decades or centuries to develop and cannot be quickly replaced. Old growth forests, forests that have never been clear-cut, have mycorrhizal networks of extraordinary age and complexity. The old trees at the center of those networks, Simard's mother trees, are connected to hundreds of younger trees and appear to play roles in the network. The younger trees cannot replicate, removing them changes the network in ways that affect the whole forest. This is one of the scientific arguments for preserving old-growth forests beyond the aesthetic and ethical arguments that are more commonly made. The biological infrastructure of the forest is as important as the trees themselves, and old-growth biological infrastructure cannot be quickly rebuilt. The forest is one of the oldest living systems on Earth, doing what it does without observation or acknowledgement, the network running through the soil and darkness, as constant as it is invisible. Tonight somewhere, trees are moving carbon through fungal threads to neighbors that need it. Old trees are feeding young ones through connections that have been maintained for decades. A system operating with a kind of generosity that has no intention behind it and no less value for that. The network runs in the dark. Most of what matters does. You are part of a living world that is much larger and much older and much more connected than it appears from where you're standing. That is worth carrying into sleep. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service began a study in Macon County, Alabama. They recruited 399 black men who had syphilis and 201 who did not. They told the participants they were being treated for bad blood, a local term covering a range of ailments. They were not being treated, they were being observed. The researchers wanted to document the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men. When penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis in 1947, the men in the study were not told, they were not treated. The study continued. Men went blind, men went insane, men died, men infected their wives who infected their children, born with congenital syphilis. The study continued until 1972, 40 years, when a whistleblower named Peter Buxton leaked details to the press. The public outcry ended it. By then, 28 men had died directly of syphilis, 100 had died of related complications, 40 wives had been infected, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. The Tuskegee syphilis study is the most notorious example of unethical human experimentation in American history. It was not an aberration. It was part of a long and largely unacknowledged history of treating certain categories of human beings as acceptable subjects for experiments that would never be conducted on others. The history of medical experimentation before the modern ethics framework is deeply uncomfortable to examine because it produced genuine knowledge alongside genuine atrocity, and the two cannot always be cleanly separated. James Marion Sims is considered the father of modern gynecology. His surgical techniques for repairing vesicovaginal fistulas, a devastating and painful condition, have helped millions of women. He developed those techniques by operating repeatedly on enslaved black women in Alabama in the 1840s without anesthesia. The women could not consent. He operated on some of them dozens of times. Sims argued that black people felt less pain than white people, a belief with no scientific basis that was widely held and that served the convenient function of making the experimentation feel less troubling to those conducting it. The belief persisted in various forms into the 20th century and has been documented, influencing clinical pain management decisions well within living memory. The knowledge Sims produced was real. The method by which he produced it was monstrous. Both things are true simultaneously, and history does not allow the second to be erased by the first. The Nazi medical experiments conducted in concentration camps during World War II represent the most systematic and deliberate program of human experimentation in modern history. Prisoners were subjected to hypothermia experiments, immersed in ice water to establish how long people could survive and how to most effectively rewarm them. Information that was militarily relevant for rescuing pilots downed in the North Sea. High-altitude experiments simulated the conditions of unpressurized flight at extreme altitudes. Infectious disease experiments deliberately infected prisoners with malaria, typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases to test potential treatments. The experiments produced some data. The data is tainted in its origin in ways that have generated serious ethical debate about whether it can be used. Most of the scientific community's position is that the data should not be used, both because of its origins and because the experimental conditions were so uncontrolled that the scientific value is lower than it appears. The Nuremberg Code, developed after the war crimes trials that tried the physicians who conducted these experiments, established for the first time in international law the principles of voluntary informed consent, the right to withdraw, and the requirement that the potential benefits of research justify its risks. It was the foundation of modern research ethics. The history of psychiatric experimentation is its own dark chapter. Lobotomy, the surgical severing of connections to the prefrontal cortex, was developed by the Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz in 1935 and became a widely used psychiatric treatment in the 1940s and 1950s. Walter Freeman in the United States performed transorbital lobotomies, inserting an ice pick through the eye socket and moving it to sever frontal lobe connections as an office procedure without anesthesia, sometimes on patients who had not consented and on whom the procedure had not been clearly explained. Freeman performed approximately 3,500 lobotomies. Moniz won the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1949. The procedure left many patients docile and compliant, which was interpreted as improvement, while also leaving them emotionally blunted, cognitively impaired, and in some cases permanently incapacitated. The Nobel Committee has never rescinded the prize. The modern framework of research ethics informed consent, institutional review boards, the distinction between treatment and research, the requirement for risk-benefit analysis was built in response to specific historical atrocities. The Belmont Report, issued by the U.S. National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects in 1979, established the principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice as the foundations of ethical research. It was issued in direct response to Tuskegee. The framework is imperfect and is contested and evolves what counts as adequate consent. Who can consent on behalf of those who cannot? How to weigh individual risk against population benefit? How to conduct research ethically in low resource settings? These are live debates without settled answers. But the framework exists and it is enforced, and it has made the conduct of research in most of the world categorically different from what it was before 1972 or 1947 or 1945. The history of human experimentation is a history of what happens when the people making decisions about whose bodies are acceptable to use for knowledge are different from the people whose bodies are being used. That gap between the deciders and the decided upon is where the atrocities live. Closing that gap is what the ethics framework is for. The knowledge we have about human physiology and disease and treatment was built through a process that was not always ethical and not always just. Some of the most useful knowledge was extracted from people who did not consent and could not refuse. Sitting with that is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be uncomfortable. Discomfort with injustice is not a problem to be solved. It is a response that is appropriate to its object. Tonight, the appropriate response is to carry it lightly enough to sleep. The history does not change. What we do going forward does. That is the only part that remains open. In 1987, a paper published in Nature by Rebecca Cann, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson announced a finding that made headlines around the world and generated controversy that took decades to fully resolve. By analyzing mitochondrial DNA from women across 5 geographic populations, the researchers concluded that all living humans share a common female ancestor who lived in Africa approximately 200,000 years ago. The press called her Mitochondrial Eve. The name was immediately misunderstood. Mitochondrial Eve was not the only woman alive at the time. She was not the first woman. She was the most recent common matrilineal ancestor, the most recent woman from whom all living humans descend through an unbroken line of mothers. Other women were alive at the same time. Their lineages simply died out over the generations as some of their female descendants had no daughters. The concept is real, even if the name invited misinterpretation, and subsequent research with larger datasets and more sophisticated analysis has confirmed the basic finding. The genetic evidence for an African origin of modern humans is now overwhelming and essentially uncontested in the scientific community. The genetic history of the human species is written in DNA, and the past 2 decades of genomic research have given us the tools to read it with unprecedented precision. The key insight is that DNA accumulates mutations at a roughly predictable rate. By comparing the genomes of people from different populations and counting the differences between them, you can estimate how long ago those populations shared a common ancestor. The more differences, the longer the separation; the fewer differences, the more recent the common ancestry. Applied across thousands of people from hundreds of populations, this approach has produced a detailed picture of how modern humans spread out of Africa and populated the world. The oldest genetic lineages outside Africa are found in indigenous Australians and Melanesians, consistent with the archaeological evidence that humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago. The population that became Native Americans separated from their Siberian ancestors and crossed into the Americas somewhere between 15 and 25,000 years ago. European and Asian populations show complex histories of mixture between multiple ancient populations that migrated at different times. The ancient DNA revolution has transformed what we know about human prehistory in ways that were impossible to anticipate. Until the early 2010s, ancient DNA research was limited by the degradation of DNA in old samples and the difficulty of distinguishing genuine ancient sequences from modern contamination. The development of new techniques capturing specific genomic regions, sequencing at very high coverage, sophisticated computational methods for distinguishing ancient from modern DNA allowed researchers to extract reliable genetic information from samples tens of thousands of years old. Svante Pabo at the Max Planck Institute led much of this work and won the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 2022 for it. His team sequenced the Neanderthal genome, establishing that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred. They discovered the Denisovans from a finger bone, an entirely unknown human population identified from a tiny fragment with no associated skeletal material distinctive enough to suggest a new species. The Denisovans interbred with modern humans in Asia. Indigenous peoples of Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australians carry roughly 5% Denisovan DNA. Tibetan populations carry a variant of a gene called EPAS1, associated with adaptation to high altitude, that appears to have come from Denisovans. An ancient interbreeding event contributed genetic material that today helps people live at extreme altitude. The peopling of Europe is a story of multiple waves and complex mixtures that ancient DNA has dramatically rewritten. The original hunter-gatherers of Europe, the people who painted the cave art at Lascaux in Altamira, were largely replaced by a wave of farmers expanding from Anatolia beginning around 9,000 years ago. These early farmers mixed with the existing hunter-gatherers to varying degrees depending on the region. Then, approximately 5,000 years ago, a third wave arrived from the Eurasian steppe, people associated with the Yamnaya culture who spread rapidly across Europe and contributed the genetic ancestry that is dominant in most European populations today. The Yamnaya expansion was so rapid and so complete that in some regions, the pre-existing farming populations were almost entirely replaced within a few generations. What drove the replacement at that speed, whether it involved violence, disease, or simply higher fertility, is unknown from the genetics alone. The genetics tell you what happened. They do not always tell you why or how. The genetic history of humanity is a history of migration, mixture, and replacement on a scale and at a frequency that contradicts the intuitive picture of ancient populations as stable and isolated. People moved constantly over vast distances, mixing with populations they encountered, being replaced by or replacing populations that came after them. The genetic boundaries between populations are gradients, not walls. The diversity within any population is greater than the diversity between populations. The concept of biologically distinct human races, populations so genetically distinct that they constitute different biological categories, is not supported by the genetics. Human genetic variation is clinal. It changes gradually across geography rather than in discrete jumps. The clusters that appear in genetic data correspond to geographic regions and reflect patterns of migration and mixture rather than fundamental biological divisions. The categories we use to think about human populations are real as social and historical constructs. They are not real as biological categories in the way that the race concept implies. You carry in your genome a compressed history of everyone who contributed to you. The Neanderthal sequences 1 to 4% of your DNA if you have any non-African ancestry, contributed by interbreeding that happened 50,000 years ago. The Denisovan sequences, if your ancestry includes populations from East or Southeast Asia or the Pacific, the steppe ancestry that reached most of Europe 5,000 years ago, the farmer ancestry before that, the hunter-gatherer ancestry before that, all the way back. 200,000 years of mothers and fathers, every one of them surviving long enough to reproduce, every one of them carrying forward the sequence that eventually became you. The probability of your specific existence, given all the migrations and meetings and survivals required, is not a number that can be meaningfully calculated. You're here anyway? The sequence continues tonight, as it has for 200,000 years. Unbroken. In the 1970s, a Canadian psychologist named Bruce Alexander conducted an experiment that challenged everything the scientific community thought it knew about addiction. The standard model of addiction at the time was largely derived from a set of experiments conducted decades earlier. Rats were placed alone in small cages with 2 water bottles, one containing plain water, one containing water laced with heroin or cocaine. The rats almost universally chose the drugged water. They chose it compulsively in increasing quantities until many of them died. The experiment seemed to demonstrate that certain substances were inherently addictive, that exposure was sufficient to create dependence, that the drug itself was the cause of addiction. Alexander noticed something about the experimental setup. The rats were alone. They were in small, bare cages with nothing to do. They had no social contact, no stimulation, no choices except which bottle to drink from. He built Rat Park, a large enclosure with other rats, with activities, with things to explore and interact with. He gave Rat Park rats access to the same drugged water. They mostly didn't use it. When they did, they used it in moderation. They preferred the plain water. They did not become addicted in the way the isolated rats did. The drug was the same. The environment was different. The addiction was different. The disease model of addiction, the understanding that addiction is a chronic brain disease rather than a moral failing or a choice, represented a significant and largely positive shift in how addiction was understood and treated. The neuroscience behind it is real. Repeated exposure to addictive substances produces measurable changes in brain structure and function. The dopamine system is hijacked. The prefrontal cortex, which is involved in impulse control, decision-making, and the ability to weigh long-term consequences against short-term rewards, is physically altered. The ability to choose not to use is genuinely impaired in ways that are visible on brain scans. This is why telling someone with severe addiction to just stop through willpower is as unhelpful as telling someone with a broken leg to just walk normally. The mechanism required for the instruction is the mechanism that is damaged. But the disease model, while more accurate than the moral failure model, is itself incomplete in ways that Alexander's Rat Park experiment points toward. The environment matters, the social context matters, the meaning and purpose available to a person matters. Addiction rates are dramatically higher in populations experiencing poverty, trauma, social disconnection, and lack of economic opportunity. Vietnam veterans used heroin at extremely high rates during the war, rates that predicted a catastrophic addiction crisis when they returned home. Roughly 90% of them stopped using without treatment when they returned. The context that made the drug necessary was gone. This doesn't mean the neurological changes aren't real. It means that the neurological changes happen in a context, and that context shapes whether they produce addiction. The same substance, the same exposure in different social and psychological contexts produces different outcomes. Addiction is a disease of the brain in a specific environment. Treating the brain without addressing the environment produces limited results. The research on addiction treatment consistently shows that social support, meaningful activity, purpose, and connection are as important as any pharmacological intervention. The gateway drug theory, the idea that marijuana leads to heroin, leads to cocaine in a predictable progression, has not been supported by the research in any simple form. Most people who use marijuana do not progress to harder drugs. The correlation between marijuana use and subsequent harder drug use exists, but is largely explained by common underlying factors. The same circumstances that make marijuana available and appealing also make other substances available and appealing. The drug does not cause the progression. The context does. What does predict problematic substance use more reliably than the specific substance is trauma history, particularly childhood trauma. The Adverse Childhood Experiences study found that people with 4 or more categories of childhood adversity were 7 times more likely to consider themselves alcoholics than people with no adverse childhood experiences. The substance is often secondary to the wound. It is being used to treat. This framing, not what are you addicted to, but what happened to you, is increasingly central to addiction medicine and has produced more effective treatment approaches than those focused primarily on the substance and its pharmacological effects. Opioid addiction specifically has characteristics that make it among the most difficult to treat and the most dangerous to leave untreated. The opioid system is involved in the regulation of pain, but also in the experience of social connection, the warmth of belonging, the comfort of physical closeness, the sense of being safe with others. Opioids pharmacologically produce a version of the state that secure social connection produces neurologically. For people who have not experienced adequate, secure social connection, opioids can feel like the first experience of something they were supposed to have had all along. This helps explain both why opioid addiction is so prevalent in communities characterized by social disconnection and economic despair, and why it is so difficult to treat through abstinence alone. The drug is filling a need. Removing the drug without addressing the need leaves the need unmet. Medications like buprenorphine and methadone work partly because they provide partial opioid system stimulation that prevents withdrawal and craving while allowing function. They are treating the brain disease component. The most effective programs combine medication with robust social support, housing stability, and meaningful activity addressing the environmental and psychological components simultaneously. The moral framework around addiction, the view of the person with addiction as weak-willed, self-destructive, deserving of their suffering, is not only factually wrong, it is actively harmful. Shame is a significant barrier to seeking treatment. The stigma that addicted people face from healthcare systems, from families, from employers, from themselves, delays treatment, reduces the quality of care received, and increases the isolation that drives the addiction. Shame is not a therapeutic tool. It is a wound that worsens the condition it is supposed to address. The evidence-based position is that addiction is a complex condition with neurological, psychological, social, and environmental components that all require attention, that people with addiction deserve the same compassionate, competent treatment as people with any other chronic condition, that recovery is possible and common, and that it looks different for different people. Whatever relationship you have or have had with substances or behaviors that have felt compulsive, whatever the context that created those relationships, the brain involved is the same brain that is here tonight trying to rest. It has been doing its best with what it has. In the context it found itself in, with the history it was given, that is what brains do. They do their best. The judgment you've absorbed about that from others or from yourself is not the same as the truth of it. The truth is more complicated and more forgiving than the judgment. Tonight, the brain gets to rest from all of it. The wanting and the having and the not having and the trying to stop and the trying to start and all of it. In 1887, a peasant woman digging for fertilizer in the Egyptian village of El Amarna found a collection of clay tablets that would transform what historians knew about the ancient world. The tablets were letters, diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian pharaohs Amenhotep III and Akhenaten and the kings and governors of Canaan, Syria, Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, in cuneiform script. The Amarna letters, as they became known, gave historians an unprecedented window into the politics and relationships of the Bronze Age world. They also revealed something that centuries of monumental art and temple inscriptions had somewhat obscured. The pharaohs were not serene god kings operating in timeless divine authority. They were politicians. They complained about gifts that weren't good enough. They haggled over gold. They received desperate letters from Canaanite governors begging for troops that never came. They navigated alliances and rivalries and the constant pressure of events. The monuments show what Egypt wanted to be. The letters show what it actually was. Egypt worked because of the Nile. This is obvious but worth dwelling on because the Nile shaped everything about Egyptian life in ways that are easy to underestimate from the outside. The Nile flooded annually, rising in summer, depositing rich black silt across the valley, receding to leave fields of extraordinary fertility in the desert. The flood was called Akhet. It was the foundation of the agricultural calendar, the economic system, and the religious worldview of ancient Egypt. The Nile Valley is narrow, rarely more than a few kilometers of arable land on either side of the river. Beyond that is desert. The contrast is absolute and still visible from satellite images today. Green strip, desert, the river threading between. This geography meant that Egyptian agriculture was extraordinarily productive per unit of land, the annual flood providing natural irrigation and fertilization that required relatively little human effort to exploit, but also concentrated along a single axis. The whole country was essentially a long, thin farm with a river running through it. The predictability of the flood was the foundation of Egyptian civilization. When the flood failed, famines followed. When it came too high, it destroyed rather than fertilized. The inolometer, a device for measuring flood levels, was one of the most politically important instruments in Egypt because it allowed prediction of the coming year's harvest and therefore taxation. How much the flood deposited predicted how much the fields would yield, which predicted how much the state could extract. The Egyptian bureaucracy was enormous, sophisticated, and obsessively documented. Papyrus made from the papyrus plant that grew abundantly in the Nile Delta provided cheap, relatively durable writing material. Scribes were among the most important people in Egyptian society. Learning to read and write required years of education and opened doors to administrative positions that were significantly more comfortable than agricultural labor. The scribal curriculum included copying texts, learning the complex hieratic script used for administrative documents alongside the monumental hieroglyphic script used for temples and tombs, and developing the mathematical skills required for taxation, land measurement, and construction. Egyptian mathematics was practical rather than theoretical. The problems preserved in mathematical papyri are overwhelmingly administrative: how to calculate the volume of a granary, how to divide bread and beer rations among workers, how to calculate the slope of a pyramid. The mathematics existed to serve the state and the economy rather than for abstract inquiry. The workers who built the pyramids were not slaves. This is one of the most persistent misconceptions about ancient Egypt, and the archaeological evidence has definitively overturned it. The workers' village at Giza, excavated by Zahi Hawass beginning in the 1990s, revealed a sophisticated settlement of thousands of permanent workers who were paid in bread and beer and meat, who received medical care. Skeletons show evidence of surgical interventions and healed injuries, and who were buried near the pyramids and tombs that indicate they were respected members of society. Graffiti found at Giza, ancient workers writing on walls, as people always have, includes team names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure. The pyramid builders named their work gangs and competed with each other and wrote their names where they could. They were not free in the modern sense. They owed labor service to the state as a form of taxation, a system called corvée labor that was common across the ancient world, but they were not enslaved in the sense of being permanently owned chattel with no rights. They were Egyptian subjects performing a religious and civic duty that appears to have been associated with genuine pride in the work. Ordinary Egyptian life was governed by religious practice in ways that permeated every aspect of daily existence. The gods were not distant figures approached only in temples. They were present in the home, in the fields, in childbirth, in illness, in dreams. Household shrines to protective deities were common. Amulets were worn by people of all social classes for protection against specific threats: illness, evil eye, difficult childbirth, snake bite. Magic, Heka in ancient Egyptian, was not separate from religion or medicine. It was integrated with both medical papyri combined practical treatments, honey for wounds, which has genuine antibacterial properties, with spells and invocations that address the supernatural dimensions of illness. The distinction between medicine and magic that we take for granted did not exist in ancient Egypt in the same way. Dreams were taken seriously as messages from the gods, and there were professional dream interpreters who helped people understand what they had been told in the night. The dream books that survive list hundreds of dream symbols and their meanings, a system for decoding the divine communication that was believed to come through sleep. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul had multiple components: the K, the Ba, the Ak, and that death was not an ending but a transition requiring careful preparation and proper ritual to navigate successfully. The Book of the Dead, more accurately translated as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, was a collection of spells and instructions designed to help the deceased navigate the afterlife and reach the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, where life continued in an idealized form. The amount of resources the Egyptian state devoted to death and afterlife preparation, the pyramids, the tombs, the mummification industry, the priesthood dedicated to maintaining the cults of the dead, reflects a civilization that took seriously the idea that how you died and what happened afterward was as important as how you lived. 3,000 years of civilization, 30 dynasties, pharaohs from Narmer to Cleopatra, the same river flooding every year, the same astronomical events, marking the same calendar, the same prayers to the same gods in the same temples, rebuilt on the same foundations. And through all of it, ordinary people waking at dawn, working the fields, buying bread from bakers, complaining about their supervisors, falling in love, raising children, getting sick, being healed or not, dying, being mourned by people who loved them. The monuments survived. The people behind them were the same people who are always behind the monuments, trying to make a life, finding meaning where they could going to sleep at the end of the day, because there was no other option, and also because the day was done and sleep was what came next. Same as tonight. Same as always. On January 13th, 1982, an Air Florida plane crashed into the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., shortly after takeoff in a snowstorm. The plane went down near the 14th Street Bridge. 74 people died. 6 survived in the freezing water, clinging to wreckage, unable to swim to shore. A helicopter arrived and began lowering a lifeline to the survivors. One man in the water, later identified as Arlen Williams, passed the lifeline to others. Each time it was lowered to him. 5 times he passed it to someone else. When the helicopter returned for him, he had slipped beneath the water. He drowned. He had multiple chances to save himself. He chose each time to save someone else instead. Nobody told him to do that. Nobody trained him for that situation. Nobody was watching in a way that would reward him socially for the choice. He was a bank examiner from Atlanta. He had no military training, no emergency response background, nothing that would identify him in advance as someone who would do what he did. He was ordinary. He did something extraordinary, and then he died. The question of what made that possible, what the difference is between people who act heroically and people who don't, is one of the most important questions in social psychology, and the answers are more surprising and more useful than most people expect. Philip Zimbardo spent most of his career studying the dark side of human behavior. The Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted in 1971, in which college students randomly assigned to play guards in a simulated prison began behaving with genuine cruelty within days, was Zimbardo's most famous work. It became one of the most cited demonstrations of situational power over behavior. Ordinary people in the wrong situation with the wrong roles do terrible things. After decades of studying evil, Zimbardo turned his attention to heroism. His conclusion was the mirror image of what he had found studying cruelty heroism. Like, evil is largely situational. The same situational forces that pull people toward cruelty can, with different design, pull people toward heroism. And the capacity for heroic action is far more widely distributed than we tend to assume. Zimbardo founded the Heroic Imagination Project, an organization dedicated to teaching the psychological skills that enable heroic action, on the premise that heroism is not a trait possessed by special people, it is a choice available to most people in the right circumstances with the right preparation. The bystander effect is the most famous finding in the psychology of helping behavior, and it explains a great deal about why heroism is rarer than the human capacity for it would predict. In 1964, a woman named Kitty Genovese was stabbed to death outside her apartment building in New York over the course of roughly half an hour. Initial press reports claimed that 38 neighbors had witnessed the attack and done nothing. The numbers were exaggerated, and the situation was more complex than the original reporting suggested. But the underlying phenomenon the case inspired researchers to study is real. John Darley and Biblatane demonstrated in a series of experiments that the presence of other bystanders reduces the probability that any individual will help in an emergency. The more people present, the less likely any one of them is to act. The mechanism involves 2 things: diffusion of responsibility. If many people are present, each individual feels less personally responsible for acting. And pluralistic ignorance. Each person looks at others to gauge whether the situation is a genuine emergency, and since everyone is doing the same thing and appearing calm, the group collectively concludes that no action is needed. The bystander effect is not cowardice. It is the result of normal social cognition operating in a context it wasn't designed for. Understanding it is the first step to overriding it. The psychological skills that enable heroic action have been identified with enough consistency across research that they can be described and in principle taught. The first is situational awareness, the ability to notice that something is wrong rather than normalizing it. Most bystanders in emergencies fail to act partly because they fail to recognize the situation as an emergency. The training to actually see what is happening rather than processing it through assumptions about what usually happens in familiar settings is a learnable skill. The second is taking personal responsibility, explicitly deciding that you're the one who is going to act rather than assuming someone else will. The diffusion of responsibility that produces the bystander effect can be consciously countered by the individual decision to be personally responsible regardless of how many others are present. The third is knowing how to act. Many people who recognize an emergency and feel responsible do not act because they don't know what to do. Basic first aid knowledge, knowing how to call for help effectively, knowing how to intervene in a conflict, the practical knowledge of how to help reduces the hesitation that kills the impulse to act. The fourth is the willingness to accept the costs of action. Heroic action often involves social risk, looking foolish if you misread the situation, standing out from the crowd, potentially making things worse. The willingness to accept those costs, to prioritize the welfare of others over the management of your own social image, is the final piece. The research on rescuers during the Holocaust, people who hid Jewish families and individuals at significant personal risk during World War II, has produced consistent findings about what distinguished them from their neighbors who did not act. They were not braver in a general sense. They were not more politically aware or more educated or more religious. What distinguished them most consistently was two things. They had a strong sense of personal moral identity. They thought of themselves as people who acted on their values rather than watching others act, and they acted quickly without prolonged deliberation. The rescuers typically decided within hours or days of being asked. The non-rescuers deliberated longer and ultimately did not act. The window for heroic action is often narrow. Deliberation is the enemy of action. When the action requires accepting immediate cost for uncertain future benefit, the people who acted did not wait until they were sure. They acted from who they were before the certainty arrived. Arlen Williams did not deliberate. Each time the lifeline came, he made the same choice so quickly that it could not have involved much calculation. He passed it to someone else. He did it 5 times. Whether he knew he was dying is unknown. Whether he was afraid is unknown. What is known is what he did. 5 times he chose someone else over himself, and then he was gone. The ordinary man from Atlanta who nobody would have identified as a hero before that afternoon in January. That is how it usually works. Heroism is not usually a personality. It is a moment meeting a person who is ready for it without knowing they are ready. Most people are more ready than they think. The readiness is built in small ways in ordinary moments through the slow accumulation of choosing others in situations where the cost is low. So that when the moment comes where the cost is high, the habit is already there. Tonight requires nothing of you. No bridge, no frozen river, no choice between yourself and someone else. Just rest. The building of whatever you are happens in the ordinary time. The testing of it happens rarely and without announcement. Tonight is ordinary time. Use it to rest. That is enough. That is exactly enough.